Early autumn in Beijing usually brings with it a very distinct sense of tranquility. A chilly atmosphere blankets the vast avenues, and the lights from high-rise buildings reflect off glass surfaces like a city that never truly sleeps. Within this familiar setting of outward glamour and order, an unexpected event sent shockwaves through the entire entertainment industry. This was not due to its level of drama, but because of the prolonged silence that enveloped it immediately afterward. The name Yu Menglong quickly appeared densely across newspapers and social media. He was once regarded as a calm figure who lived privately, unassociated with the typical clamor of the entertainment world. For this reason, when he became the center of an information crisis with no end in sight, the public was not only stunned but fell into a state of prolonged bewilderment. What actually happened was not the only question. More importantly, people wondered why that question had no clear answer. In the first few hours, information appeared rapidly but in a fragmented manner. Each new report seemed to open more gaps rather than fill what was missing. There was no unified statement. There was no complete narrative. The event quickly moved beyond the scope of a single piece of news, becoming a complex media dossier where truth, speculation, and public emotion were tightly intertwined. Notably, the reaction of the involved parties stood out. Instead of early explanations aimed at reassuring public opinion, what the public received was a sustained silence. In an era where information moves at dizzying speeds, that silence is no longer a neutral state. It becomes a message, whether intentional or not. From there, a wave of analysis, interpretation, and speculation began to take shape, spreading beyond the borders of a single nation or a specific fan community. This story, therefore, does not revolve solely around an individual. It raises larger questions about how the entertainment industry operates when facing a crisis. Who has the right to speak? Who chooses silence? And what does that silence protect, or whom does it hurt? In a world where images and reputations are built over many years but can be shaken in just a few days, the control of information sometimes becomes the greatest power. But behind the layers of radiance, behind the brief news lines and attention-grabbing headlines, what is actually operating in the background? What mechanisms cause a media dossier to fall into a state of suspension, neither closed nor clarified? In this journey, we will not seek a verdict of right or wrong. Instead, we will peel back the layers of how information is disseminated, how silence is maintained, and the long-term consequences that such a crisis leaves for both individuals and the system. Because sometimes, the most terrifying thing is not the event itself, but the void it leaves in the public's perception. From the moment the first information appeared, the most noticeable thing was not the severity of the event, but the way it was conveyed. Initial news snippets regarding Yu Menglong were fragmented, lacking context, and almost devoid of logical connection. Each media source provided a small slice, but no one stood up to assemble them into a complete picture. In an environment where the public is accustomed to rapid response times and instantaneous information, this inconsistency quickly created a sense of insecurity. From a media perspective, this was a pivotal moment. The first few hours following a sensitive event usually determine how the story is shaped in the public mind. However, instead of a clear message aimed at stabilizing public opinion, what appeared was a series of words so cautious they were minimalist. There was no specific explanation. There was no clear direction. The event was mentioned, but the context was left open. That very void became fertile ground for speculation to arise. The context of the entertainment industry makes this phenomenon more understandable. For many years, this industry has operated based on an unwritten rule. Silence is often seen as the safest choice in the early stages of a crisis. The goal is not always to clarify the matter, but to minimize the risk of it spreading. Yet, that rule collided directly with public expectations in the digital age, where transparency is seen as the measure of responsibility. Yu Menglong's public image also played an important role in increasing information pressure. Before the incident, he was perceived as a person who lived discreetly, spoke little, and was not associated with controversy. That very quiet image created a paradox. When a character perceived as stable and principled suddenly appeared in a shocking newsline, the public tended to ask more questions than usual. This was not because they suspected the individual, but because they could not find a familiar pattern to explain it. The absence of an official statement during this period clarified the concept known as information gaps, voids that are unavoidable but have a massive impact. Each such gap does not exist independently. They overlap and stretch over time, creating a feeling that something is being hidden. Meanwhile, the mass media, bound by time pressure and competition, was forced to rely on indirect sources, unconfirmed accounts, or data that had not been fully verified. At this stage, the role of social media became particularly prominent. No longer a passive receiving channel, social media users participated directly in the process of restructuring the story. They compared information, asked questions, and proposed hypotheses based on small pieces of data. Every post and every comment contributed to shaping the collective perception, sometimes faster than mainstream media channels. In that context, the silence from involved parties did not reduce the heat. On the contrary, it made the wave of discussion even more vibrant. From an analytical viewpoint, it can be seen that the crisis did not begin with the event itself, but from how the event was communicated. When information is incomplete, the public is forced to fill the gaps themselves with emotion and speculation. This is a natural reflex. Humans have a tendency to seek completeness in a story, even if they must rely on unconfirmed data. Therefore, every hour that passed without clear information increased the risk of the story being led in uncontrollable directions. This also reveals another paradox of modern media. While technology allows information to spread at an unprecedented speed, the ability to control and direct that information has become more fragile than ever. A choice of silence, whether stemming from legal caution or image strategy, can quickly be interpreted as avoidance. In that case, the real message no longer lies in what is said, but in what is not said. At the end of the first stage of this dossier, no conclusion has been reached, nor could one be. The only certainty is that an information structure lacking transparency was formed from the very first steps. It was this structure that laid the foundation for the entire subsequent media crisis. Before the truth could even appear, the story began to live a life of its own in the public perception, moving beyond the control of any individual or organization. The question now is no longer about right or wrong, but about the danger of those information gaps. Does silence truly protect those involved, or does it only make the crisis prolonged and more complex? This is the starting point for the next media wave, where silence is no longer a neutral choice but becomes the focal point of every analysis. From this point on, the crisis was no longer driven by the nature of the event, but by how the public and information channels reacted to the prolonged silence. This turned the incident involving Yu Menglong into a media avalanche, where every small detail had the potential to trigger a new wave of debate. Social media acted as the strongest catalyst. In this space, information is not categorized by its level of authenticity, but by its level of attention-grabbing potential. A hypothesis shared enough times can quickly take on the appearance of an unverified truth. Users do not just receive content, they actively participate in restructuring the story by connecting fragmented pieces of information. Timelines were constructed, relationships were inferred, and every individual deduction continued to be spread as a real possibility. In parallel, mainstream media fell into a dilemma. On one hand, they faced pressure to update constantly so as not to be left behind in the information race. On the other hand, they lacked confirmation sources strong enough to draw clear conclusions. The result was that many news reports were descriptive, repeating what was already known, or quoting public reactions instead of providing new data. This repetition inadvertently amplified the feeling that the story was growing, even though the essence of the information had not changed significantly. In that context, the silence of the involved parties was gradually interpreted as a message. For one segment of the public, silence equated to the necessary caution in a sensitive matter. For another segment, silence was seen as a sign of avoiding responsibility. These two opposing understandings created a clear divide in public opinion. One side called for waiting, emphasizing that all conclusions should be based on official information. The other side argued that the prolonged wait had eroded trust and caused the story to slide far away from the trajectory of transparency. Immediate consequences began to appear. Related projects were suspended, not necessarily because of negative conclusions, but because of image risk. In the entertainment environment, where reputation is directly tied to commercial value, uncertainty is often more dangerous than confirmed bad news. Brands, platforms, and partners chose to stand aside, waiting for a clearer picture before making the next decision. This freeze, although preventive, contributed to reinforcing the feeling that the crisis was spreading. Psychologically, the public's reaction during this stage reflected a very basic need, the need to understand and to be reassured. When official information was insufficient to meet that need, emotion filled the void. Sympathy, skepticism, anger, or disappointment all had the opportunity to appear concurrently. Each individual, based on their own experience and beliefs, chose an interpretation for themselves. And when those interpretations met in cyberspace, they formed powerful currents of public opinion that were difficult to reverse. Notably, in this media avalanche, the role of truth became blurred. It was not because the truth was unimportant, but because it had not had the chance to appear fully. Instead, the story was driven by pace and emotion. Questioning headlines, articles analyzing possibilities, and speculative comments created a self-reinforcing loop. Each new piece of content relied on what had been spread previously, making the boundary between data and inference increasingly difficult to distinguish. From a media analysis perspective, this is the stage where silence reached its peak impact. It was no longer a mere void, it became the center of the story. Every analysis revolved around why there was no statement, who benefited from not speaking out, and how long that silence would last. Thus, even without making a sound, silence shaped the entire subsequent progression of the crisis. Once the avalanche has formed, controlling its direction becomes extremely difficult. Every belated intervention effort risks being seen as a passive or insincere reaction. This is the point where an information crisis transforms into a crisis of trust. The public no longer just asks questions about the original event, but also about how the media system and the involved parties chose to react. When the media wave reached saturation, the story gradually moved into another phase. This was no longer the time for new information to appear at a rapid pace, but the time when parallel hypotheses existed with no single hypothesis strong enough to close the dossier. The incident involving Yu Menglong was no longer viewed as an isolated case, but as a quintessential example of how a story can be hung in suspension in the public space. At this stage, what was most noticeable was public fatigue. After many days and weeks of receiving repetitive information and overlapping speculations, attention was no longer explosive as it was at the beginning. Instead, there was a sense of prolonged insecurity. People no longer asked what had happened, but began to ask why there was still no clear answer. This shift marked an important turning point in the media dossier. The focus was no longer on the event, but on how the system reacted to that event. In the absence of official conclusions, potential scenarios began to form as a way for the public to reorganize their own perception. Each scenario was not seen as the truth, but as a parallel possibility. Some scenarios emphasized media chaos and the misunderstandings arising from it. Other scenarios focused on the invisible pressure of the entertainment industry, where silence is seen as a defensive strategy. There were also scenarios that questioned the responsibility of the involved organizations but did not reach specific conclusions. Importantly, no scenario was completely discarded because there was no data strong enough to do so. It was the simultaneous existence of multiple possibilities that turned this dossier into an open dossier. It was not closed by a declaration, nor was it resolved by time. Every time an old detail was mentioned, the story came back to life in the perception of a segment of the public. This shows a notable reality of modern media. A story does not need an ending to continue existing. As long as it has not been clarified, it still has the potential to return at any time. From a systemic perspective, this was the moment that most clearly revealed the limits of traditional media crisis management. The strategy of silence, once seen as a tool to calm the situation, no longer worked in a decentralized information environment. When there is no reliable information center, each individual becomes a small broadcasting point, contributing to the maintenance of attention toward the story. Thus, the power to control information no longer resides entirely in the hands of the organizations or individuals involved, but is dispersed into the receiving community itself. The peak of awareness in this dossier did not lie in a shocking discovery, but in a silent realization. The public began to understand that the biggest problem was not a lack of information, but the lack of a transparent mechanism to handle information when a crisis occurs. When there is no clear process, every reaction is situational, and every gap can be interpreted in many different directions. This was the moment the story moved beyond the individual scope, becoming a warning for the entire entertainment industry. From this viewpoint, the dossier with no end carries a different meaning. It reflects a reality where reputation, power, and responsibility do not always walk hand in hand. In a system where images are meticulously constructed but the mechanism for dialogue with the public is limited, every crisis risks becoming a long-term fracture. This is not because the event itself is too large, but because the system's way of handling it does not keep pace with social expectations. Looking back at the entire progression, it can be seen that the climax of the story was not a specific moment, but a process of collective awareness. When the public realizes that silence, whether stemming from caution or strategy, can create unpredictable consequences, the story has fulfilled its greatest role. It does not provide an answer, but it forces people to re-examine how information is managed and the responsibility of those who hold power in the public space. After everything that has transpired, what remains is not a clear conclusion, but a prolonged silence in the public perception. The media dossier surrounding Yu Menglong was not closed with a definitive statement, nor did it disappear over time. It quietly exists as a hanging question mark, a reminder that in the modern entertainment world, not every story has a complete ending. From a social perspective, this incident has left a clear consequence. Public trust has become more fragile. When information is not presented fully, the void does not just exist in the news cycle. It spreads to how people perceive an entire system. Silence, whether stemming from caution or strategy, is no longer understood as neutral. It carries different interpretations depending on the position and expectations of the recipient. This dossier is therefore not just the story of an individual. It reflects a broader issue, which is the relationship between power, information, and responsibility. In an industry where images are meticulously built and reputation is a precious asset, controlling information is often prioritized over open dialogue. However, the digital age has completely changed that balance. The public no longer accepts waiting indefinitely, and a lack of transparency is easily seen as a deliberate choice. The biggest lesson to be drawn from this dossier does not lie in finding right or wrong, but in how we understand the role of the media. When information is interrupted, the media does not just reflect reality, it inadvertently creates a new reality through the way it reports, asks questions, and amplifies emotions. An unclarified story can become a symbol for many deeper anxieties, from power imbalances to the feeling of being excluded from the process of accessing the truth. For the entertainment industry, this is a silent but clear warning. Every crisis is not only a test for the individual involved, but also a test for the entire information handling system. In the absence of a transparent and consistent mechanism, every effort to control an image risks backfiring. Silence may help delay risk in the short term, but it creates long-term aftershocks. Looking to the future, unfinished media dossiers like this may not be the exception. In a world where information is created and spread continuously, the biggest challenge is no longer speed, but responsibility. The responsibility to speak out when necessary, and the responsibility to remain silent in a transparent manner when it is not yet possible to speak. In the end, what remains for the public is not a complete answer, but the right to ask questions. That right, if used soberly and fairly, is the factor that keeps the boundary between truth and speculation from being erased. And perhaps, that very sobriety is what needs to be protected most when facing stories that remain unfinished behind the glamorous lights of the entertainment industry.